examples they cited to make the determination, they eliminated cargo out of the rule based on an ineffective cost-benefit analysis. I think the cost was supposed to be upwards of $500 million, and it was only a $31 million benefit. Now, I would say that that's a dangerous way to go in the sense that you could weigh and maybe weight the idea of what the cost is or the benefit is. First of all, like I said, I think it was flawed. They weren't measuring a 777 loaded with dangerous goods barreling down into Los Angeles. They picked a stuff that fell short of a runway in Florida somewhere, in Tallahassee, in a remote area. So flawed cost-benefit analysis, but all the same, I think we should maybe look, or you could look, the committee could look at as to whether or not, so when we're dealing with safety issues, do we want that to be the #1 weighted factor, or do we want it just somewhere in the list? Second of all, here's the real situation. Imagine this for a moment, and I use this example a lot. You have a school bus in one lane on a highway, and it's proven, and you got your children on that school bus. Okay? You've got your children going to school on that school bus, and right next to it is a tractor trailer carrying a bunch of freight on it. It's a proven fact scientifically that time awake of 17 hours or more on task is equal to a blood alcohol level of about 0.05. So you have a very sober driver driving your kids to school, and right next to him is a tractor trailer. I can bring that up, who's impaired, obviously impaired. My point in bringing it up is we share the same skies. We fly over the same cities. We land at the same airports. I remember that even if you know traffic collision avoidance system, it was included in passenger airplanes and not in cargo aircraft. And it took an almost head-on collision with Air Force One to make that change. So it's a gaping, if I had to describe it as anything, you're only as strong as your weakest link. We have a great safety system, but that's one loop, that's one gap that needs to be closed. And here's, I'll conclude with this because it's an important statistic. When you look at the two individual risk factors of both passenger ops and cargo ops, and you look at the frequency with which passengers fly and cargo fly, with it kind of tallied if you looked at the number of departures, and we swapped, and we did as much flying as passengers did. In a million departures, 10 years, you'd have 276 accidents in that 10-year period. That's the difference in that risk profile. It's startling. So we really need to close that gap because only as strong as the weakest link.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll yield the remaining of my time to Representative Napolitano as she has to go vote for another committee.
Thank you, Mr. Carvajal. Ms. Bassani, I fly twice a week back to California and coming here, and I have the greatest respect for flight attendants, the primary connection customers. They get asked every imaginable question about safety, security, and efficiency of the airplanes and the airlines. And I have overheard flight attendants asked questions that only an aerospace engineer could answer. Yet they have been very diligent and intelligent in answering questions. Do the airlines, the FAA and the airplane manufacturers give you sufficient training to handle any question, especially technical questions? Should it be your job to handle them?
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your question, Ms. Napolitano. That's a loaded question. We do receive annual training, emergency training. They don't cover questions, for every single incident. No, I would say no. Flight attendants in themselves are a very inquisitive group, and of course, the longer that you're around the airline and working in the airline, you do gain knowledge that you wouldn't normally have just as a passenger. But there's so much now that has changed in the airline industry. Perhaps that's something that we do need to pursue. And I thank you for that question.
I would think so. Thank you very much. I have other questions for the record. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Napolitano. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I wanted to get back to the foreign repair stations, Mr. Samuelson, and I know in your testimony you talked about the fact that I think both in 2003 and 2015, the IG has identified on several occasions weaknesses in the FAA's oversight of overseas repair stations. The FAA Reauthorization Act of 2012 and 2016 addresses repair station oversights. We're talking about issues of drug testing, pre-employment background checks, and security screening. Now we have Thailand and Costa Rica classified as Category 2, and Category 2 is defined as the government does not have the confidence, to meet safety standards. So I just want to ask, it's been somewhat asked already, but what are the FAA's stated reasons for the failure to implement this law?
I honestly don't know that the FAA has articulated a good reason for allowing these loopholes to continue and allowing the work to be sent overseas. And certainly they don't have a good reason. There is no reason for them to continue to allow U.S. flagged carriers to do work in the countries that you mentioned that have been downgraded. It's a potential disaster waiting to happen. And we've heard a lot of conversation today about safety being the paramount issue in not only the aviation industry, but across the entire transport sector. And I don't think that the current situation with the FAA, all passenger air carriers recognize safety as the paramount, as their paramount function. I think they are willing to jeopardize safety in order to maximize profit by sending aircraft maintenance into foreign countries that have objectively less safe standards than we do on U.S. soil.
And have you yourself been to some of these foreign repair stations to witness it for yourself?
I have not, but we do have plans to go to Brazil to try to access the hangar where American Airlines is doing some work.
Thank you. And
shoddy work.
Thank you for that. And Captain DePete, is this a concern for you?
Oh, absolutely, ma'am. Madam Chairman, over my entire career, it's pretty clear whenever we've had an aircraft come back from a foreign maintenance station, we're always taking a good look, and we ourselves have found instances in all our carriers where that can occasionally happen. It depends on the carrier. Some of the countries where we have these foreign maintenance stations are decent players, and others aren't. They typically go to the lowest bidder, and I've always said this, skilled labor is not cheap, cheap labor is not skilled, and you end up
Thank you.
getting what you pay for.
Ms. Bassini, do you have concerns about
Oh my
these
God, yes.
foreign repair stations?
Of course we do. In fact, we have supported the TWU in their quest not to offshore American jobs. We think it's very, very important to keep those jobs not only on our soil, but for the reasons that John Samuelson outlined. It's going to keep our aircraft safer, and we fly in those aircraft, so we have extreme interest in how those aircraft are maintained. So we want to keep them here.
Thank you. Captain DePete, Mr. Sullenberg was here at our last hearing and talked about the simulators and about the importance of full motion simulators to create that muscle memory.
Sure.
And in your testimony, you talk about this, and you talk about how there seems to be a movement within the industry now to move more towards non-motion
Yes, ma'am.
simulators. You talk about, the pros and cons on both. If you could just speak to that, I have 34 seconds left.
Okay, that's a really great question, and I'll try to answer it quickly. We just recently had an instance where it's a requirement now to have upset and recovery training. Losing control of the aircraft, having our crews trained to be able to handle that situation. And there were some airlines that were looking at doing this in a non-full motion simulator, and you just simply wouldn't get the same effect in terms of the training. So yes, it's really important. And simulators are great. They can do certain things, and they can not do others. They never a good. They don't replicate a real flight. In fact, I know as a line check airman for FedEx that there were times when people that would teach only the simulator and would be only in the simulator, and they were instructors. When they would go back to actually flying the real airplane on the line, they would actually have to take somebody with them just to kind of go through, because it is a different experience. But as I know the fidelity has increased in some of these machines, but they haven't reached a level to where it equates to really flying the airplane. So, your experience matters.
Thank you very much, and I thank all the witnesses for being here. This is a very important hearing, and appreciate you very, very much. And I now recognize Ms. Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I second what you just said, Madam Chair. I have a question first for Mr. Samuelson, because I remember in your testimony that you had indicated that the FAA had directed agencies, all workers rather, at foreign repair that Congress had directed workers at foreign repair stations who perform safety-sensitive work to undergo pre-employment background checks. Do you have any information on the kinds of vetting that is currently being done? I'm particularly interested in whether what happens abroad is consistent with the vetting we require here.
Yeah, so what happens abroad is absolutely inconsistent with what happens on U.S. soil, and certainly it's one of the reasons why the work is less safe when it's done overseas, in most overseas countries. And the FAA has failed to follow through on what Congress has.
How long have they had so far?
Several times over the last decade, Congress has acted. But the FAA is lax in their enforcement, and it's potentially going to lead to a disaster. I mean, we've seen a disaster in the air transport system recently, and certainly the FAA seems to be waiting around for another disaster to occur to start addressing these things. They should be proactively addressing these things and mitigating against the introduction of risk into the passenger transport system.
This is an
aviation
open
system.
hole, obvious hole in our system. It doesn't have to do with airplanes. It has to do with people. I'm very concerned and ask for follow-up so that we can get a response from the FAA on when they intend to and how they intend to conform with what Congress has apparently asked them to do some time ago. Ms. Bassini, I really can't resist asking you about something you mentioned, because you mentioned the kinds of animals that you can bring on to planes. I mean, monkeys, chickens, pigs, I can't believe this. Miniature ponies, penguins, come on. I can tell you, if you brought some of those onto a plane, I'd have to get off. And so I must ask you if the FAA bill, there's Section 437, and I don't know precisely what it requires, but I wonder if you think it requires enough to address who gets onto planes, who is really a legitimate passenger. And I'd like to know if Congress needs to do more to keep from frightening passengers with who gets brought onto planes. I like your response and the response of any of you on this.
Thank you, Congresswoman Norton. Yes, well, we support Section 337 of the FAA bill, and it should clarify
It's
what
437, go ahead.
what constitutes a service animal in the first place. And, you know, they're not trained, so they need training on how to travel if they're going to bring those service animals on board.
You know, a service animal is that defined in the statute, or just somebody that makes you feel better about being on the plane? I mean,
It's emotional, I'm sorry, it's emotional support
well,
animal.
that means anything can get on the plane.
Well, we've seen almost anything on the planes, that's for sure.
Yeah.
There
Again,
needs to be some oversight on this, there,
I
definitely.
hate to ask for a hearing on this, but I am going to have to ask if for Congress to try to clarify what we mean, and this sounds so open-ended that it is not what we intended. Finally, Ms. Schultz, could I ask you, I'm concerned about the outsourcing of aircraft maintenance to foreign repair facilities, and whether there has been any investigation by NTSB that have linked aircraft crashes to outsourcing of any kind? Have you even investigated that?
Well, thank you for your question. We do not have a position. We have not established a position on that because we have not seen that factor. But I will add that clearly we are going to look at all factors that can contribute to an aviation accident, including maintenance. And
It's outsourcing I'm particularly concerned about.
right, so we have not addressed that at this point.
Do you think, will
haven't
you be
seen it.
addressing that? Will you be looking at that?
Certainly, if the evidence points us in that direction, we will do our normal comprehensive job of looking at that as a
Again, I'd
project.
like to ask the committee to ask that NTSB look at any outsourcing when it comes to aircraft we ought to be looking at. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Next, I'd like to recognize Representative Katko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. Good afternoon. It was morning, now afternoon, and hopefully it doesn't go into the evening for you. I do thank you all for being here, and I, again, want to acknowledge the parents in the corner as you're there at all these hearings, and our heart goes out to you all, and God bless you for what you're going through. Obviously, the name of the game is safety, and how can we make it better? And so for Mr. Schultz, the first question I have is, there seems to be efforts afoot to support the efforts over the last several decades to change the aviation regulatory culture from punitive to collaborative. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and what that would mean if we could try and get more collaboration, less punitive going on, so we can have better things, better procedures going forward.
And I'm sorry, was that question for me?
No, I'm sorry, it's for Dana Schultz.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the question. I think that from the NTSB standpoint, we have certainly supported the approaches that are being taken. We are observers on the commercial aviation safety team and the corresponding ASIAS activity that occurs to integrate a lot of these programs that I know Captain DePete mentioned with regard to flight operations quality assurance and the Aviation Safety Action Program. We also have actually, to the point of having a memorandum of understanding with those organizations to obtain information to help us when we're looking at safety issues in a particular investigation. And I think what we have seen is that there's a wealth of information in those systems, but it's really predicated on people coming forward and being unafraid to come forward and bring up information that could be very useful to identifying previously unknown hazards in the aviation system. So we do have a working relationship with those groups. We've seen value to contributing to our investigations. We are appreciative to the committee for our authority to use voluntary safety information to inform our investigative process. That's where we're at today.
Is there things we can do better, even more in that regard, to improve the process?
We don't have a position in terms of a recommendation on those processes because we haven't seen a particular deficiency. I think that for us, it's continuing to be able to work collaboratively with the industry to get access to that information. It can help us identify emerging issues in the aviation safety system through our incident investigation process, much like we did with the Air Canada 759 investigation. So we appreciate that authority.
Thank you. Captain DePete, is there anything you want to add to that before I ask you another question?